Them Alive by Nace. Read by Al Richardson. Chapter 1. The small sailboat shuddered repeatedly as the rumblings that shook the nearby Caribbean island tossed the surrounding waters into a froth. Dyke Mellis grabbed the rudder and firmly stared in horror at the small piece of land that had been his refuge. Dark storm clouds hung over the island, and occasional bolts of lightning pounded the trees and the small settlement on the shore. The wind increased, and it became even harder to keep the boat steady. Dyke lashed on the safety harness and tied down the rudder. He looked up at the single sail, whistling as it drove the boat deep into the enraged sea, then pulling it out amid a groaning of timbers. With one hand, Dyke tried to bring the binoculars up to study the fate of the Columbian island that had come to mean so much to him. Suddenly a tremendous rumbling began, much stronger than before. It was a sound he felt more than heard. As he watched, the buildings on the island began to sway. One of the tallest cracked and collapsed. Earthquake! A cold terror gripped Dyke. Something began to disturb the sea between his boat and the island. The stormy sea quietened for a moment, then turned white. Slowly the sea began to rise. Dyke blinked his eyes in disbelief and wiped the glasses. He looked again. It was unmistakable. A solid wall of water was beginning to rise, blotting out the beach and part of the island. In a flash, the realization hit him. Earthquake? Tidal wave. Frantically, Dyke worked to free the rudder from its lashing. He looked over his shoulder as he worked. The wall of water had risen some 30 feet and was rushing steadily towards him. Finally, the lashing knot parted, and Dyke swung the rudder hard over. Seconds counted. They were the difference between life and death. If the deadly 30-foot wave struck him broadside, it would splinter his craft and him into 1,000 pieces. The only hope was to take it head on. Dyke crouched, frozen with fear, as the small boat slowly turned towards the wave. Like a deadly race, the boat turned slowly, and the wave rushed rapidly. It seemed forever. Then suddenly the monster sea was upon him. Vision and sense left him as he felt the heavy mass jerk the boat like a match and tumble it up over and over. Seawater jerked at his arms and legs. It submerged him, then freed him, then submerged him again. His hands flailed each time he went under, searching for something to grab onto. Finally the cycle ended, and he felt the solid grasp of wood in his fingers. He cleared his head and tried to focus. The tidal wave had passed on, leaving his boat afloat, but badly damaged. The mast was gone along with most of the rigging. By some small miracle, his safety harness was still attached to the cockpit winch clew. That had been all that saved him. His mind told him to go below and check the damage to the hull, but shock and disbelief kept him rooted in the cockpit. That, and the instinct that told him that this sturdy boat, which he had himself rebuilt, would never fail him. That even if the mast and sails were gone, the small engine would help him make it to some port. He looked back at what was left of Malpelo Island. He shook his head. Could he credit his vision that had been blurred so long, or his head that had ached constantly since his torture 11 years ago? But what he saw was real. The after effects of the earthquake were still tearing at the island, strewing sides of houses, pieces of trees and carts, halves of dogs and people into the water, bouncing them around like kindling. A new fear gripped Dyke. What if Malpelo disappeared from the ocean? Where else could a fugitive from the United States like Dyke go? He'd hidden on that island safely all this time, enjoying his existence, nurturing his plans to track down the 4 men who had once been his associates, with a vow to wrest sanity from their minds and manhood from their bodies, as they had done to him. Dyke looked again. Yes, miraculously, there was still an island there. Criss-crossed by crevices, most of its buildings flattened. More a shambles than civilization, the small landmass rose from the water. Some of the buildings were swaying on their splintering foundations, others collapsed, crushing the people who tried to rush from them. Still other structures burst into flame, dancing their fires against the black sky above and the heaving waves below. The few people left alive were running one way, then the other, going nowhere in their fright. All at once, Dyke's mouth dropped open, his eyes catching something new, a sight he'd never seen before. What were those giant creatures that were crawling out of the cracks in the earth? Were they animals of some strange kind? Were they outsized snakes that had lived deep in the ground and were now being torn from their long-buried dens? No. Snakes had no flailing legs, no bulging bellies, no shapes like whatever those things were. They were insects. Gigantic, elongated things, were pouring from somewhere deep inside the ground that had burst open in the great crevices. They were clambering over each other to escape their caves or undersea holes or wherever else they'd lived. They must have dwelt beneath the island for thousands of years. They must be a throwback to the dinosaurs. They looked as big as men. No, they were even larger. They were huge green monsters with small front legs that ended in claws and great hind legs that resembled those of kangaroos. Their bellies, which seemed to burden them, must have been over half their weight. Dyke shook his head again, needing to clear his mind, hoping to make the demonic mirages disappear. But when he looked again, the prehistoric beasts were still there. More of them every moment. They popped out of the quivering ground by the dozens, the hundreds, the thousands. They were beginning to cover the island now, to scurry over it hungrily, leaping with their hind legs, digging with their clawed front ones. Now and then one rose into the air, unfolding enormous green wings from its back, and soaring about before dropping to the earth again. Dyke refocused his glasses, studied the creatures with their veined wings, their frightful jaws that moved constantly. They were praying mantises. But their shape was the only thing they had in common with the miniature variety that ran harmlessly over parts of the United States. They were monsters, greedy green monsters. They looked as if they would eat anything they could catch, chewing it to bits in their enormous jaws. They were even grabbing for each other, taking nips from other mantises' legs, heads or bellies, chewing the bites with cannibal gourmet pleasure. Dyke moved his eyes from the insects to the rolling water. The ocean was settling down now, the waves subsiding, the foam scattering. The earth too was growing quiet now, some of the cracks closing, others settling into canyons never seen before, deep cuts that spewed forth the beasts he would, have never believed without seeing them. He opened his eyes wider, staring in horrified yet pleasurable fascination as one fissure closed on the bounding barrage of hundreds of green bodies, squashing them as they climbed wildly to escape it. Some of the mantises were safe, but for a hind leg they could not pull loose. Others had only their heads out of the crevice, while still others were caught by their middles, their enormous bellies smashed in death as the fissure snapped shut on them. Dyke shivered in delicious disbelief, fancying he heard the thundering crunch as the mantis bodies were crushed flat. But the dead insects were scarcely missed. Certainly not by the other mantises, as they continued their digging and clawing in the earth in apparent search for food. 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 They must have been starving in their underground home. Perhaps because little food came their way. Perhaps because there were so many of them for anyone to know a full stomach. As Dyke started to lower his glasses, he was caught by the new activity that snapped the binoculars back to his eyes. Even in his blurred sight, he knew what he thought he saw. One of the mantises had cornered a man, poor old Kelowani, Dyke's 80-year-old neighbour who couldn't run fast enough to escape the wildly dashing insect. It flopped him onto the ground and began eating him, as if he were a fish, a hunk of meat, or anything edible. And it did not bother to kill him before devouring him. He lay kicking, and no doubt screaming, as the green monster ate him, alive. Dyke stared harder, feeling his stare mount into a growing interest that bordered upon fascination, even obsession. He muttered aloud, "God, what's happening to me? I've seen blood before. I've stabbed men and drained them of their blood. This isn't new." And yet, he realised it was new to him. Seeing a man eaten alive. He'd never considered human flesh to be food, but now it was a feast to this beast that was dining upon old Kello. He added to himself, "How can I be so tied to the sight that I can't look away, that I want to see every bite the mantis takes out of old Kello? Why do I want to watch the creature as he eats the flesh and sucks up the blood? I don't know why. I only know that the feeling is with me. It's taking me over. It's making me enjoy old Kello's slow death. God, I haven't felt this exhilarated in years, not since I lost my manhood and, with it, my genuine joy in living. Oh, I wanted to stay alive to get even with the men who ruined me. But I haven't known any kind of real excitement in all this time. I was a boy the last time I felt completely alive. Until now. But now I've got something to live for. Because I love watching a man being eaten by a monster. Maybe it's a substitute for my lost virility, I don't know. But I know it's a joy I never thought I'd feel again." One of the insects, the one not eating the body, snapped off the arms and legs, gathered them into its arms, and moved a short distance away to chew the flesh from the bones. Old Kello was still living, writhing, trying desperately to work the dismembered trunk of his body loose. But the mantis atop him was holding the octogenarian down with his enormous hind legs, which made old Kello powerless, and the green beast was eating away ravenously at the human being, at last biting off the head and mercifully ending Kello's life. Popping open that head to claw out the brain and stuff the whole of it into his immense maw, chewing it to bits. Then he pounced onto the body cavities, ripping the man from the throat down, and laying the halves of it apart, as Dyke felt himself getting hot, eager for more and more flesh and blood. The beast paused to savour the tender heart, then moved to the other organs, grabbing out the intestines like a starved animal that's just found a meal. Liver and stomach came next, and Dyke seemed to taste them, along with the monster. He'd never seen a human heart or liver before, or intestines either. He felt personally gratified as they disappeared. Blood was reddening the white sand, he noted. The beast sometimes ceased its ingesting of the old man's flesh to suck at the blood, to drink it as if it was his water, the only means of quenching his thirst. And as more blood ran from the body than the beast could swallow between bites of the flesh, other mantises rushed to him and sucked up as much as they could of the brilliant red fluid that old Kello gave up before he died, and after as well. When the mantis had torn off the man's arms and legs, came close again, apparently hoping for another juicy part, the second insect gave him a kick with one hind leg that sent the outsized creature rolling upon the white sand with its red stain. Others of the beasts, even the ones that were helping suck up Kello's blood, paused to peer at the one consuming the man, and seemed not to dare to do battle with him. And Dyke saw that this particular mantis was half again as large as the rest of them, which no doubt caused him to be respected by his kind. From that moment on, the man beneath him was his meal alone. He finished off Kello within minutes. Dyke then saw the other people of the battered island. Perhaps 8 or 10 of them were left alive after the earthquake had heaved and torn apart all semblance of human habitation, and finally settled into new earth that was carved into canyons, running behind stumps of trees, trying to dive into the newly formed ravines, digging under flattened parts of buildings, doing whatever they could to find possible hideouts, going wherever they could to avoid the claws and the ever-moving mandibles of the hungering mantises. But not a man, woman, or child escaped the grabbing hands, the terrific, terrorizing jaws of the great insects. One by one, the fear-stricken humans were hunted down by the Orthoptera and eaten to death, faster than Dyke had ever seen a cat make an end of a mouse or a chicken of a worm. He pulled himself up to his 5'2" in the boat and put down the binoculars for a few seconds. He'd given and taken almost every torture known to mankind. He had believed bitterly. He had shot and been shot, robbed and been robbed. He'd driven slivers under fingernails and set them afire. He'd pounded nails through the hands of bankers to force them to open the vaults. He'd cut off men's fingers, broken their legs, and run sharp knives down their faces. He had been heartless, graveless, shameless in every way, so he thought, until now. But God, he'd never eaten anybody, nor had he had any followers or hirelings who would do it for him. Yet now Malpelo was populated by mammoth insects that appeared to relish the taste of human flesh. Perhaps Dyke could use that amazing, alarming relish to his advantage. He would be the only person on the island. He could be the reigning master of the giant insects. Couldn't he? Then, with a flash of realization, he went taut, clenching his fists. Why should he assume that the mantises would spare him, when they were plainly not sparing any other human being they could reach with their claws? He'd always talked to himself, having lived alone for so long that he heard no man's voice but his own, for the most part, for days on end. He said aloud, "All right then, I have to find a way to live among these green critters and stay alive. I have to. This is my first big chance at a strange new way of disposing of enemies, by being tortured to death." The chance must not slip away from me. Suddenly he laughed, slowly, evilly, without mirth or sympathy, without any feeling except his own knowing need for revenge, a revenge that had become the only thing he lived for these 11 years. Suppose a man, say Dyke Mellis, were to devise a way to hold power over the great green mantises with their fearsome veined wings, their protruding eyes, their jaws that were never still. What could such a man not do with such monsters as his slaves? He kept chuckling, mulling the notion in his aching head. He asked himself aloud, what would the 4 guys who left me for dead back on that miserable waste of that cattle ranch in Texas do if I slipped up on them without any warning, without any noise of any kind, one at a time? How would Pete Stewart, Kane Garrister, Ryan Gout, and Zeb Hilburn feel if a dozen of those awful green monsters, or even one of them, jumped upon him and kicked him to the ground and began to eat off his face, his ears, his arms, and his legs, and then tore his body open and ate out his insides? Like him, those men had done their share of torture, he knew. The 5 of them had played God and made judgments of punishment, chopping off fingers or toes or ears before they shot their victims or threw them off cliffs for the pure pleasure of watching as the human prey writhed, screamed, begged, moaned, and finally gained their horrible deaths. Would not Dyke's 4 enemies beg pitifully on their abject knees if he came marching at the head of a hungry horde of praying mantises that were commanded to devour Dyke's torturers? God, what a devil's joy that would be! The more he thought about it, the more he determined not to miss it. And would not his other potential foes, meaning any lawmen who took out after him for all or any of his heinous crimes, be subject to the same remarkable fate? Would not the insects on the island kill ununiformed officials as easily as they would his 4 erstwhile buddies? That would be unmitigated happiness to him. Watching policemen go into a mantis's maw piece by piece, down the beast's throat and into that unbelievable belly. Dyke promised himself on the spot that if that happened, he would stand by and cheer loudly so the cops could not mistake his applause as they died. Then, all in a sinister second, Dyke let out a yell of terror. In his eagerness to see the mammoth beasts close up, he'd forgotten to try to start his engine and attempt to steer his boat a safe distance from the isle. He was dangerously near to the scavenging cannibals now. So near that any of them who spied him might leap or fly the short span and begin snapping off his body parts one at a time, until he was swallowed entirely, disappearing into the bulging belly of a giant beast. He seized the helm tightly once more, then remembered that he had no sail, and that his motor might be unusable since the storm. He rushed to the engine at the other end of the craft. It was intact, though he'd never know how it could be. He whirred it once, twice, 3 times. On the 3rd pull, it groaned and growled, purred and took off. He swung the boat around, heading towards the open sea. But in the next electrifying second, he saw that he was too late. Enormous green legs were bobbing up and down in the water beside the boat, trying to mount the side of it. Their legs were successful at last and were followed by the head, the clawing arms, the beating, bounding stomach. The mantis was the over-large one, the beast that the others had not dared challenge. The great insect could eat Dyke in fewer than a dozen bites, and he certainly had that intention. His eyes were appraising the man hungrily, his clawed hands moving eagerly, his cavernous mouth working faster every second. Dyke knew he was dead if he didn't think fast. Thinking quickly had always kept him alive. It must not fail him now. He had a gun aboard the boat, as always, but he didn't want to shoot this special insect. Besides, it could well be that no bullet on earth would penetrate that thick hide, a virtual shell. So Dyke popped into his cabin, grabbed the heaviest of his nets of woven rope and flexible steel, the kind he used to snare wild animals in the Colombian jungle when he wanted them alive. He'd learned the art of lassoing as a boy, and it had served him well, more than once. He flung the rope around and around his head, aiming it at the advancing mantis. The great protruding eyes seemed to see it coming, and the arms reached out to fight the enclosure, but Dyke had snared things even larger than this fearsome beast, and he could not afford to miss, not if he valued his head. He dropped the net over the mantis neatly, immobilizing the maddened mammoth, making it his prisoner in only a few moments. He pulled the rope tight, fastened it to a windlass, and wound it tighter yet, securing the rope with iron clamps. God, it was lucky that the storm had spared a few things on deck and the contents of the cabin. Triumph made him confident, daring, ready to test the plans that were formulating in his mind. Even the constant ache in his head didn't disturb them. If he could tame this one insect, teach it to respect him and follow his commands, then he could tame others, make them a powerful force to do his evil bidding. He could take his vengeance upon four enemies at his own will and pleasure. But how did a man go about taming a creature such as this? He told himself how. Why, with food, of course. Every living thing understands the power of food given and received. In a few days, or maybe weeks, this mantis could be following me around without any damned harm to me at all. It could be begging for food that it knew nobody but me had the wish or willingness to give it. He leaped back into the cabin and ran down to the galley. He had meat there, an almost endless supply. The foot of water that the storm had washed in had not reached it. He always snared or shot many times what his freezer on the island would hold. He was forever oversupplied. He liked it that way because it allowed him to take things easy when he wanted to spend a week or a month sleeping in the sunshine of the isle, or letting his boat drift over the calm sea. He seized 2 hind quarters of a puma he'd shot a few days ago. They were in the battery refrigerator, but not yet in the freezer. They would be thawed and ready to meet the mantis's almost insatiable appetite. He ran back upstairs and unwound the rope, working behind the beast's back so his actions could not be glimpsed by those eerie eyes. He knew he must toss the meat into the snare without letting the insect out. When the opening was wide enough, he flung the 2 slabs of puma meat close to the mantis's jaws, then retightened the net. Instantly the immense creature was upon the animal flesh, cramming it into his maw with clawed hands, crushing even the bones. While Dyke watched with proud approval, believing that his handout would satisfy the great green being's hunger pangs for the moment, the thing swung about and met Dyke's gaze with its own, extending its grabbing hands for more, tearing at the ropes that imprisoned it, biting the snare when Dyke did not immediately produce more food. Dyke felt certain that the snare would hold the beast. But he wanted this mantis to depend upon him personally, to respect and appreciate him, eventually to follow his orders. He hoped to train the wild creature to kill and eat 4 men, the 4 men who had rendered Dyke less than a man. He brought another load of meat, all he could drag behind him from his galley refrigerator. Then he lugged a 3rd load and a 4th. At last the insect sat back on its hideous green feet, its belly distended beyond belief, its jaws finally quiet. The bulging eyes seemed to look upon Dyke with friendliness, and the head drooped lazily before it bobbed down against the body, resting upon its own feet and stomach. The monster slept. Dyke felt a kinship to the unnamed thing. Perhaps it was because he felt that this was the first time the mantis had ever had its hunger satisfied in full, and Dyke had known countless times what it was to be hungry and to have nothing to eat. He remembered that when you hungered enough, nothing was of more importance except food. It could be that when this mantis awoke, it would be inclined to feel companionable towards the man who had filled its belly with meat. But of course, Dyke could not take that chance. He would take the snared beast to the mainland and into the jungle by dangling meat ahead of it. He had a shack there with food to spare, where he often spent a few nights when he was tired of the isle. If the proffered food didn't make this beast his friend, deeply devoted and eager to serve him, then he would have to try and make himself inedible in another way. He tried many different baits to snare jungle animals that had not worked, because the taste was unpleasant to the palates of wolves and pumas and monkeys and other Columbian creatures. He would test the possibilities until he discovered one that a giant mantis newly popped out of the ground in an earthquake would not sample, would not even sniff. If he could eventually put together such a concoction, something so foul that this beast would not eat him when the stuff was smeared over his body and clothes, then he would be safe to return to Malpelo and live among the mantises there, to start training a few of them to wreak his vengeance when he decreed that time had come. He told himself, God, if any man anywhere ever deserved to take his revenge and enjoy the taking, it's me. Those 4 guys did everything to me that their lousy minds could dream up to kill me, slowly, horribly. A weaker man would have been as dead as they believed me to be when they left.